Alrighty, so in chapter 11, we are going to be looking at victims of rape and sexual assault. I've mentioned this previously, but it's worth repeating here that this is one of those highly underreported categories of crime. So, any official statistics that you're going to be reading about in the textbook or that we'll talk about today is not going to include that dark figure of crime. And there are a lot of them, particularly with young people not reporting sexual assault. So, kind of keep that in mind as you're reading through this. We probably get more accurate and a more accurate depiction of the scope of the problem if we look at crime victim surveys when it comes to sexual assault. So just keep those things in mind as we go through. Now, first of all, there's a couple of different definitions, rape and sexual assault. Sexual assault is the newer term that we prefer because it encompasses a variety of behaviors, and both males and females can be victims. All states include legislation statutes that define rape and sexual assault. The FBI defines rape as penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without that person's consent. And when you look at the Uniform Crime Report, the older statistics related to rape would be based on that definition. Now, sexual violence, again, a term that is preferred, includes other behaviors. So it can really include completed or attempted sexual violence. So it's really any sexual act committed against someone without that person's consent. It doesn't have to be actual penetration. It can just be attempted or unwanted sexual contact. So that's important to kind of keep that in mind, that we prefer this term because it encompasses more behaviors and more victims. All right, when it comes to the scope of the problem, again, keep in mind that these statistics are really not going to include that dark figure of crime because this is a highly underreported category of crime. So these are just some of the official statistics. In 2009, 88,000 forcible rapes were reported to law enforcement. In 2015, almost 1% of all people between the ages or over the age of 12, and that accounts for about 2.7 million people in the United States, had experienced at least one violent victimization. If you look at this is the Uniform Crime Report, and I just pulled up some statistics on 2018, which is the last year that the Uniform Crime Report has so far. I mean, they haven't put up the 2019 statistics yet, but we can look at rape over the years. So this starts in 2008, and you can see we had a little bit of a dip there, and then going back up. So we actually have an increase in the number of reported sexual assaults. And then if you scroll on down, this is from the NIBRS, and this is rape in 2018, and it has a lot of, remember some of these databases have more information than others. And remember, the NIBRS was created after the Uniform Crime Report to kind of expand what we knew about both victims and offenders. So in 2018, with the NIBRS, they had 56,000 rape incidents and 58,000 offenses reported to the United States. You can look at here victims by gender. The vast majority of victims are female when it comes to sexual assaults. That does not mean that males cannot be victims. They absolutely can. It just happens to be a crime that is more often perpetrated against females. When we look at the offender, the vast majority of offenders in sexual assaults are male. We also have demographics here in terms of location. You can see residence or home, schools, field, just really interesting information on location, the victim's relationship to the offender. Offenses linked to another offense. Was there a kidnapping, abduction, sodomy? You can see if there were any other offenses that took place at the same time, and the type of weapon used in the offense. So you can explore those on the Uniform Crime Report if you like, but it gives you a much an interesting look into the scope of the problem. If you look at page 398, table 11.1, it has some more rape and sexual assault statistics. An estimated 90,000 rapes were reported to law enforcement in 2015. The estimate was 6.3% higher than in 2014 and 7% higher than in 2011. Annually, rape costs the United States more than any other crime, about $127 billion, followed by sexual assault, $93 billion. 8% of rapes occur while the victim is at work. Of those raped, 81% of the women and 35% of the men report short-term or long-term impact, such as post-traumatic stress disorder. We'll talk about some of the long-term effects, and they're similar to some of the other sexual assault categories that we've looked at. All right, one of the things that is really important for your age group to know and understand is the scope of the problem with campus sexual assaults. This is a big problem across the United States. We first started doing research on campus sexual assaults in the 1950s, and so they've been doing studies for a very long time. And the studies show that we have an increasing number of people that are being assaulted on on campuses. And one of the really disturbing aspects of this is the vast majority of people who are sexually assaulted on campuses don't report them. So this is a really highly underreported category of crime. So 20% of rape and sexual assault victimizations were reported to the police compared to 30% among non-students. So we have more people not reporting the victimization to police when we're talking about college age women and men. Rate of rape and sexual assault reporting was 1.2 times higher for non-students. So we're just not getting students to report it as often as people who are not students. Most 51% of student rape and sexual assault victimizations occurred while the victim was pursuing leisure activities, like being at a party or at a frat house, things like that. The offender had a weapon in about 1 in 10 rapes and sexual assault victimizations on campuses. Rape and sexual assault victimization of students, 80% were more likely than non-student victimization to go unreported to the police. Again, I really want to drive home that students are less likely to report this. And they've done surveys on why students are less likely to report this. And some of the reasons that they found is a lot of students feel like they somehow contributed to the behavior because they were drinking or they were at a party. Some people don't know or understand that they've been victimized. Again, they might have been drinking or taking drugs and passed out and not understand that they are legally unable to give consent at that point. A lot of people knew the offender and didn't want to get that person in trouble, didn't want to have other people talking about him, didn't want their parents to find out, didn't want to go through the criminal justice system. And a lot of those reasons are the same reasons that non-students report as well. But we find that those are the reasons that students don't report. We also have a newer area that we're really kind of focusing on with research, and that is sexual trauma within the military. Recently, there's been kind of a shift in trying to break the silence, the code of silence that kind of goes with being in the military. There was a study called the RAND Military Workplace Study that was created by the RAND Corporation in conjunction with Congress to really kind of look at all branches of the military, include both men and women as victims, to get an idea of the scope of the problem within the military. Some of the things that they found were that risk of sexual assault was found to be to vary substantially by branch of the military, which was interesting. For example, they found that men and women in the Air Force experienced substantially lower rates of sexual assault than those men and women in the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. Some of the other interesting things that they found was because this one really did expand and try to include men as victims. So men who were sexually assaulted were more likely than women to have experienced multiple incidents, been assaulted by multiple offenders, and been assaulted at work or while on duty. Men were more likely to describe an event as hazing or intended to abuse or humiliate them. Sexual assaults of men were less likely to involve alcohol than those assaults against women. And men who experienced a sexual assault were less likely to report it to the authorities than a woman would be. And that goes also, that trend does follow out into other aspects of men being victimized as well. Men are less likely to report that. Now, when it comes to the legislative framework, of course, we have rape laws in all 50 states, and we have federal rape laws as well. Remember, every state can create their own laws in terms of how they define rape or sexual assault, and how they are going to charge and the penalty. So we have had a lot of movements movements in the past, really probably 30, 40 years to kind of create rape laws, reform current laws, educate the public on the various types of sexual assault. So we really saw a lot of rape law reforms implemented between the 1970s and the 1980s. And that did help to increase the number of victims who reported sexual assault and help with prosecuting. Um, sorry. We also had, starting in the United States, really kind of a trend towards what are called rape shield laws. And these, again, will vary by state. Um, Rape shield laws were originally designed to keep a woman's past sexual history out. It shouldn't be a legal question at all or brought up in a trial, but that's really what this was designed to do. So it doesn't matter if a sex worker has been victimized, they shouldn't be allowed to bring in her previous history. Or if a victim has had sex with somebody the day before and then says no the next day, that's still a sexual assault. So that's what these laws were designed to do. It still happens, unfortunately. Another aspect of rape shield laws that is more recent is trying to protect the identity of victims. So not releasing the names of victims to the press or public, for example, or trying to shield the victim's identity while they're testifying in court, maybe cutting the cameras in court, blocking a person's face, things like that, really trying to protect the victim. And again, the idea was to try to increase the number of people that are reporting it and try to increase the number of people who go through the legal process. Because a lot of people feel, again, we've talked about this in past, victimized a second time when they go through the legal system. They don't want to go through the trial process. They don't want their past history dragged up. So that's what these rape shield laws were really designed to protect, to encourage people to report, to encourage people to follow through the legal process, to testify, things like that. Now, this still happens, especially with the advent of social media. So victims' names are getting out there, their identities are getting out there, unfortunately, but that's what these were designed to do. Now, Title IX was a law that was passed in 1972. And it was really designed to protect women on college campuses from discrimination in athletic programs. So a lot of women were not getting the scholarships and other perks that a lot of male athletes were getting. So Title IX was designed to prohibit that type of discrimination against women when it came to athletics on college campuses. Now that over the years has been expanded out to include any program that receives federal funding. So this is any state or public college. The aim was to ensure equal distribution, again, of funds in athletics, expanded out to any program that receives financial assistance, and also against sexual assault and unwanted sexual pressure, sexual harassment. All of those things are now covered under Title IX. So that includes students, anybody that works on campus. So it can include college professors, pressuring students, things like that. So it includes any unwanted sexual harassment and sexual violence on campus. Or it doesn't have to actually be on campus. Any program, even if it's off campus. So if there is a school activity, a sports activity, a school club activity, anything that is related to the school. So it doesn't, the sexual assault or the harassment can be off campus as well if it is a school related activity. Now, some of the barriers to reporting rape, younger people are less likely to report rape. That is one barrier. We also have race. A lot of minorities are less likely to report it. The involvement of alcohol or drugs. Again, this particularly affects young people who may have been drinking or using drugs at the time the incident took place. And so they feel that they are somehow responsible for it or they contributed to it. And that is not true. When you are drinking, when you are legally drunk or you've been taking drugs, you are unable to give legal consent. The relationship with the offender, if they knew the offender, it's a former friend, a former dating partner, somebody that they are just is an acquaintance, or if it's a family member, that can keep people from reporting. The seriousness of the assault, the use of weapons, and then the fear of retaliation, shame, the fear of blame, the fear of being victimized again by the criminal justice system. Those are all reports. Some negative rape beliefs. We do have some kind of, in this country, we do have some kind of theories, ideas, stereotypes that we hold on to about rape that that contributes to people not reporting, and it also contributes to kind of our perception of victims, kind of victim blaming. So before the rape, it depends on if it's a stranger or non-stranger. If it's a stranger, we're more likely to have empathy for the victim, the time between the incident and the report, the use of force. If somebody is acquainted with the offender, she might be less likely to report that. If she meets them in a risky place like a bar, she's less likely to report it. And also, as the public, we might perceive them as contributing to their victimization. Was her behavior provocative? Was she drinking? Was she dancing? And none of those things matter, by the way. You can be dancing naked on top of a table, and if you say no, no means no. But we do have kind of attitudes about people that if they are engaging in risky behavior or they're being provocative, that they somehow contributed to their victimization. During the rape, the location of the assault, the weapons used, she consents, then changes her mind. She doesn't resist or scream or call for help. Those can change. Those can change our perception about the victim. After the rape, again, weapons used, resistance of the victim are things that we look at. She doesn't immediately report it or tell anybody for a while. She has no bruises or torn clothing. She doesn't go for a medical exam. She stays with the offender or sees them again or resumes her usual lifestyle. Those things will all influence our perception of the victimization and also the likelihood that she might report the sexual assault. All right, when it comes to typologies of sexual trauma, and there are a lot of different typologies of rapists out there. The Groth typology, that's Groth, is a really widely used one within the criminal justice system. Rape trauma syndrome was one of the three typologies identified by Burgess and Holstrom in 1974. So this is one of the earliest typologies that we have. They created this typology based on interviews with 146 people between the ages of 3 and 73 who had said that they had been raped. Of the 146, 92 women between the ages of 18 to 73 were classified as rape trauma victims. And with this particular typology, they came up with several different types of victimization. So the first category is um, rape, defined as rape, sex without the victim's consent. And then they further broke that down into two different types. A blitz rape occurs out of the blue without any prior interaction between the assailant and the victim. So this is um, a rape between somebody who doesn't know the offender. So this is kind of our worst fear type of rape, where somebody is attacked in a parking lot or somebody breaks into your home. So it's out of the blue. There's no prior contact. Confidence rape is when you have an interaction prior to the assault. So there is some type of relationship between the offender and the victim. The second type is pressured sex, and this can involve an inability to consent. For children, for example, if you're under a certain age, you can't give legal consent. This could also include drinking alcohol and not being able to consent. So sexual acts are against the victim's will, and they are forced by the assailant to do the sexual acts. The assailant stands in some type of relationship of power over the victim. They gain access to the victim by three methods. They pressure the victims to take material goods. They pressure victims to accept human contact. They pressure victims to believe the sexual activity is appropriate and enjoyable. You can see how this would be a category against children. They make sure the victims get something out of it so as not to be perceived as negative at the time. So that could be money, goods, things like that. And then that also eases their own guilt, by the way. Then we have sex stress situations, sex with initial contact, not a case of assailant gaining access without consent. Clear that initially consent was given. Usually what went wrong was the assailant exploited this agreement in several ways. So this is when we have two people engaging in consensual behavior, but at some point one person says no, but the other person presses forward with that. This could also, as you see here, also include consenting couples, like statutory rape, where maybe like a 15-year-old has consensual sex with her 18-year-old boyfriend, but the parents find out about that and they contact the police and want to press charges against the offender because the offender was 18 and the victim was 15. Most of these cases are not taken to court. And then we have the last category, which is workplace harassment. So these are confidence rapes. Remember, there's a relationship between the victim and the offender. And these are just those that take place at the workplace or on a school setting or with somebody that is in a position of an authority, so school or employer. Fail to intervene. These would, with the school, we're talking about those that would fall under Title IX that we just talked about. And they could also come under harassment laws with workplace as well. Case of senior in high school sexually harassed at work by 6-foot intimidating male in his 30s. This is an example used by the textbook. Coworkers and supervisors did nothing. Harassment escalated to touching, then forcing her into a closet and forcing her to perform oral sex. There have been cases on college campuses where people in positions of authorities have coerced students to engage in this type of behavior for grades or for something else. But that would also be an example. And again, these would fall under Title IX regulations as well as the legal system. The psychological impact of sexual assault. The psychological impact, and we've kind of talked about this in previous chapters when we talked about sexual assault, would include all of those things that we talked about previously. There can be short-term and long-term issues, including depression, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse issues, cutting issues, problems in long-term romantic relationships. And again, especially if somebody does not get help, this can really affect somebody long-term when they've experienced a sexual assault. So everybody has a different response to sexual assault, and it will really kind of depend on the type of sexual assault, the the relationship between the victim and the offender, if there were injuries in the sexual assault, and then a person's own coping mechanisms. All of those will affect how somebody's going to respond to this type of trauma. Burgess and Holstrom did a study that was twofold, and they looked at how the victimization can impact a victim, and they found there was kind of two different responses that will influence how long term and how acute the response will be on the victim. So how their suffering will be. It's the clinical response and then the institutional response. So the clinical response is typically right after the event. So how was the victim treated by the hospital, by the doctors? And then the institutional focus is how was she generally treated by the criminal justice systems. So they are just suggesting that how a victim responds and whether or not they're going to have both short-term and long-term suffering will kind of depend on the response of our culture to the victim, how much, how many services are offered for help, and how the institutions that respond to the victim, including medical, the DA's office, the criminal justice system, and if it's really negative, we talked about how a lot of people feel re-victimized by the criminal justice system. That can kind of compound their reaction, and kind of make it a more long-term impact. We have talked about PTSD in the past. Remember, PTSD is an anxiety disorder that people can develop when they feel like their life has been threatened in some manner. Rape trauma syndrome, which kind of includes the symptoms of PTSD. This was actually a term that preceded PTSD by 6 years. PTSD was actually added into the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in 1980. And if you remember, some of the symptoms of PTSD include flashbacks of the event. It can be fear, anxiety, flashbacks, avoiding particular situations. PTSD can be really difficult to treat. There are medications you can take for anti-anxiety, but there's so many other symptoms that go along with PTSD that make it difficult to treat. It does affect women more than men, and it really can be difficult to treat long term. Classifying rapists. To better appreciate what the rape victim has gone through, it's helpful to understand more about the rapist, including things like what prompts the offender to rape, what are such offenders like, do they progress from less serious offenses to more serious offenses, how do they choose their victims. There are a lot of rape typologies out there that look at factors related to the offender. The Groth typology that I mentioned earlier is one of those. So Groth, Burgess, and Holstrom created the earliest typology back in 1970. Back in the 1970s. Now there have been other typologies created as well. Most researchers, most professional people in the criminal justice profession do prefer the Groth typology because it is fairly easy to understand and fairly easy to classify a rapist into one of these categories based on the assault on the victim, the level of violence, those types of things. So they found anger rapist, power rapist, and sadistic rapist. So anger rapists these are people that have kind of just a high level of interpersonal violence and aggression in general. the rapes or sexual assaults are not primarily motivated by material gain or sex, but they do. These are just kind of violent or aggressive people, and they take that type of violence and aggression out on their victims with kind of pressured sexual activities, forced. There's usually not a lot of violence, or not a lot of physical injuries with this category. And then we have the exploitive rape. And the exploited rape, sometimes also called the power reassurance rape, expressed aggression is generally low and does not exceed what was necessary to force the victim's compliance. They have a callous indifference to the victim. They have issues of power and control. They probably feel like they don't have control in their life outside of this arena, and so this makes them feel like they have more power over people. The rape experience for the offender is one of anxiety, excitement, and anticipated pleasure, premeditated and preceded by sometimes obsessional fantasy for the victim. Offenses become repetitive and compulsive, they may also increase in their aggression over time. So as they increase with victimization, they can become more aggressive. And then we have the anger rapist. The sexual assault in this category is categorized by high expressive aggression, unprovoked physical and verbal aggression, or physical force that's in excess of what would be necessary to gain the victim's compliance. So we might find more injuries to the victim with an anger rape. Rape is evident. Primary motive is not sexual arousal, suggesting not fantasy driven. It's more about, again, having control over the victim. Sometimes just having anger towards women in general, maybe from childhood issues, maybe having issues with their relationships outside of this. So they're angry at a partner. And then this is the category that we are most worried about. This is the sadistic rape, where the aggression itself is eroticized. The offender is referred to as a sexual sadist, derives satisfaction in the sexual abuse of their victims. Sexuality and aggression become intertwined. So these are people that get sexual pleasure out of hurting, humiliating the victim. The assault is deliberate, calculated, premeditated. They often stalk their victims. They often, there's usually a lot of injuries to the victim that can be really devastating injuries, including mutilation, and then unfortunately also homicide in some cases. So this is definitely the category that we worry about most with sexual assaults. Now, when it comes to the response for victims, that is also something that we have really been focusing on in the last 30 years. The National Sexual Violence Resource Center. This was funded by the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And the goals are to strengthen the support system serving sexual assault survivors, to provide accurate and comprehensive information and technical assistance in supporting effective interventions, to identify emerging policy issues and research needs to support the development of policy and practice related to the prevention of sexual assault, to develop the organizational structure and technology capacity supporting the development and implementation of these activities. We also have the same SART programs that I've talked about previously. Remember, these programs really were designed to train first responders, particularly medical professionals, on how to deal in a compassionate way with victims. So the sexual assault nurse examiner SANE program, this is the one that we talked about previously, has grown exponentially. And not only do they train nurses that are going to be working with sexual assault victims on how to be compassionate with the victim, how to kind of understand their behavior, their victimization, also using equipment that is a little less invasive. Because remember, we talked about how that exam to get the rape kit can be very invasive in terms of the exam, having to take photographs, having to try to gather evidence like pubic hair and fluids. But also it trains them on how to do this using equipment that is a little less invasive, how to document bruises and injuries, how to maintain that chain of evidence so that none of this has to be redone. Super important. And again, I think I mentioned this earlier, but a lot of nonprofit agencies have also popped up in larger cities, especially, that help sexual assault victims. There's a program here in Nashville where it trains volunteers to go through this exam at the hospital. So volunteers would actually be called when somebody has been sexually assaulted and they're going to a medical facility for this exam, for this rape kit. And this volunteer has been trained on how to help the victim get through this, to explain what's going to happen to them. So it's really, a nice program, and it's completely a nonprofit organization here in Nashville, and other cities would have this as well. Nonprofit, and it's volunteers who go through the training and then go to these facilities and stay with the victim while they're going through, and this can be hours, by the way, going through these exams, and to help them have some support there with them and also to understand what's happening to them. All right, if you have any questions on anything that we've talked about in this chapter, let me know. Otherwise, have a great rest of the day.